Thank you for joining episode 19 of our podcast series, Sitting with God on the Brink of Eternity. This one is especially near and dear to my heart. I've entitled it God's Love of Variety. Teresa and I have a little cottage down close to a lake in East Texas, and we've spent a lot of time there. I write there, and we also, during the early part of the pandemic, spent a lot of time in isolation there. And so I was sitting out on the porch one morning, having a quiet time, doing some journaling. And a friend of mine, Walter Parrish from Boston, old friend from a long time ago, Walter called. And as we were having a talk, he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Well, we're down near the lake." And he said, "It sounds like you are in a bird sanctuary." And that's sort of what it did sound like. I started listening with that idea in mind, and there are so many birds with so many different sounds. It's amazing. But I love nature. I love the variety in nature. It fascinates me. It is amazing. I wrote down a few facts to share with you. Living organisms on Earth. How many are there? Well, they have identified 2 million, but the most widely cited estimate is 8.7 million species of living organisms. There are more, since we're talking about birds, more than 11,000 bird species. Dogs are everywhere down near the lake, and they're between 195 and 500 different dog breeds. And then you get into the really big numbers. The total number of fish species in the world is approximately 33,600, so I'm told. 3,000 snakes, if you're a snake lover. I'm glad it wasn't more, but 3,000 is a lot of snakes, or kinds of snakes. About 435,000 unique land plant species. 435,000. That's a lot. Tree species, 73,000 plus. And then living insects. There are more insects than any other group of living creatures. 900,000 different kinds of living insects. Wow. And then the biggest number, the variety of colors. They say there are 18 decillion varieties, and that would be an 18 followed by 33 zeros. That's a big number. God obviously loves variety. His whole creativity demonstrates that beyond any shadow of a doubt. So, what gave me the idea for this particular lesson is the fact that when I was in this hospital, that is a very large hospital, it is a teaching hospital, and it was like walking into the United Nations. There were people from all over the world, most of them of color, we would say. Not necessarily African Americans, but there were a lot of African Americans, many people from Africa, maybe second generation. We had conversations. They would tell me about their home country or country of origin or where their parents came from. And I would ask, "Have you been there?" And many of them would say no. And I would say, "Well, I have. Let me tell you about my experience there and my view of your nation." But most of them were people of color, and they were great servants. They had great hearts. They kept me alive. And it just made me think about diversity. Because if God created all the diversity in nature that we've mentioned with those facts and figures, then wouldn't it be strange if he had created his uh, top, the very epitome of creation, the human being made in his image? Wouldn't it be weird if he made us all one color or one type, or we all looked alike? That would be contrary to the very creativity of God. And so as I thought about that, it increased my feeling that any concept of or demonstration of white superiority when it comes to the race issue That is exceedingly negative to me. That is against the nature of God. He is a creator and he loves diversity. So the idea that one color of skin is superior to another, I think is an affront to God himself. That's what I think about it. You know, the word race is a misnomer. There is no such thing as race except when we talk about the human race. And there are several ways to show that beyond any shadow of a doubt. Ashley Montagu was a Jewish anthropologist, and in the year I was born, 80 years ago, 1942, in that year, he published a book entitled Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. It was interesting to me that even though he was early on and Charles Darwin had written his material in the late 1800s, or at least the second half of the 1800s, Montagu didn't buy into Darwin. Darwin said that the black person was less evolved, and so he wasn't nearly as intelligent as a white person and all of that kind of stuff. He said a similar thing about women. They were definitely inferior to men intellectually and in every other way because they weren't as involved as the male part of the species. All of that, of course, is ridiculous. But Ashley Montagu did not buy into that, and he was a very well-known anthropologist, and he carried the day with those in his field. And so basically, any anthropologist today that's trained would say there is no such thing as race scientifically. There simply is not. I have a friend, you asked, okay, so why the different colors and facial features and hair texture and all of that? Why do we have the differences that we do on Earth? I have a friend at church. He happens to be African American, but he spent his career teaching social studies at the 8th grade level in his home state of Mississippi. One time we're having this discussion, and so I said, James, his name is James Williams, a dear brother, but James said very succinctly, he said that your color of skin is determined by where your ancient ancestors came from. That's a very brief description, but it's absolutely accurate. And it's accurate because of vitamins and sunlight and how they interact with each other. For example, vitamin D, you have to have large amounts of that. It's involved in developing bones and everything else. I won't go into the details of that, but at any rate, vitamin D is a necessity of life. And so if you live in a part of the world that you don't get much sunlight, your skin has to stay light colored in order to absorb enough vitamin D from the sunlight. You don't get enough from food, you have to get it from sunlight. And then if your ancestors are down in a part of the world that is close to the equator, then you're going to have a lot darker skin because there's a ton of sunlight. You're going to get way more vitamin D than you need. But there's another vitamin, a vitamin B complex called folate, and that particular vitamin is flushed out of the body very quickly by sunlight. And so if you're around the equator, if your ancestors came from that part of the world, then the melanin in your skin had to kick in and make your skin dark, or else you'd lose your folate reserve. And that's a dangerous thing to do. So vitamins and sunlight answer the whole thing about our skin color. Now, you can research all of that. I'm not an expert in that field by any means, but there's enough information and enough research that's been done that you can easily study it out on your own, as I have done. And I've talked to other people that know a lot more about it than I do, and they will confirm that fact. Then, when it came along that the DNA string got solved, the DNA proof is the same as the anthropologists came up with. The DNA says that basically it has nothing to do with the color of your skin. And so I found a quote among many But here is a quote that came from Harvard's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences website back in 2017. But Vivian Chow was writing under the general heading of how science and genetics are reshaping the race debate of the 21st century. That was the subheading. But then the article itself was New Findings in Genetics Tear Down Old Ideas About Race. And one of the quotes that I pulled from that article is this one. It says, ultimately, there is so much ambiguity between the races and so much variation within them that two people of European descent may be more genetically similar to an Asian person than they are to each other. And I've watched all of that play out in demonstrations on channels that took college kids, had them trace their DNA string and compare them to each other in the class, and it turned up exactly like Chow wrote in the article, that you could have two white people that were much more like those of what we would normally call other races, which further substantiates the fact that there is no such thing as race scientifically. Now, if you've read your Bible and you believe it, you wouldn't even need DNA. You wouldn't need the field of genetics or the field of anthropology. You would know it from reading the Bible. Here's what Acts 17 and verse 26 says. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And so we all started off with Adam and Eve. Noah, there were seven plus Noah that got off the ark after the flood. And so we all came through Noah's line as well, but we're a part of the human race. That is who we are. And so there is no such thing as race. I talked to my African friends that were raised in Africa, and they say that in their land, you could be on the wrong side of town and get killed because you are of a different tribe. So we don't have to be different colors to hate. Haters gonna hate. That was the subtitle of one of my articles on my blog, Black Tax and White Benefits, which we'll talk about more in the next segment. But in that blog, I just point out that without Jesus, we're going to hate. Maybe it's because someone's a different color, but it will be because of something. In Titus 3:3, Paul described the human race, described what happens when we don't have God and we're not following his principles. He said before conversion, we were hated and being hated. That is the universal experience without Christ. And then in 1 John 5:19, he tells us why. Because he said the whole world is under the control of the evil one, talking of Satan. Says that also in the book of Revelation. But at any rate, haters gonna hate. That was the subtitle. Unless Jesus changes our life, haters gonna hate. But the whole thing of it being because of the color of our skin, that is a horrible reason to have attitudes towards someone else or see them as inferior or see them as lacking something that you have. That kind of prejudice is one of the most dangerous kinds that we can have. Racial prejudice or just flat racism. And so we need to learn a lot more about that. I'm going to talk a bit more about it in the next segment. But I've said for many years, I'm not colorblind. I am colorblind as far as how I view people and their value before God. We're all made in the image of God. The color of the skin does not make us more or less valuable. It's impossible that it could because God loves variety. I think, though, of the concept of being color aware and color appreciative. I am color aware. I notice all the differences in people and I appreciate them. Just think of the various ethnic differences in us all over the world. Think of music, think of food, think of all the blessings that we have because we are so different, because God did create us with the capability of being so different in so many ways, and God wanted us to enjoy that. So I'm not colorblind, I am color aware and color appreciative because God loves variety and I do too. I love all of the various different customs, all of the different kinds of buildings, all the different kinds of food and dress and dances and on that God gives us in this great variety that He built into the human race, the capability for all of that. And He wants us to rejoice and be glad in it and not in any way let us see it as something negative or something more positive about us than someone else, or something more inferior about us than someone else. We are His blessed human race, made in His images, created for His purposes, created for relationships, like we said in the last episode, relationships with one another to be His family. And so I rejoice in the diversity and God's variety that He made, especially in the human variety. Okay, we get to the good part of session number 19 here. I'm very excited about my guests today because they're dear friends from my church group, as most have been, that have been on as my guests. But these two are really special to me. And on the subject, they are the ones to have for sure. And so we have today Chris and Michelle Carter. Michelle is a friend from Boston many, many years ago. She was a teen when I met her. She now is the mother of 4. She's got 4 little ones, and they are beautiful. I love her kids. But she is an RN by training and job profession in the past. Right now, I think you're a full-time mom, right? Mm-hmm. You'd have to be with those. Those guys have energy. Chris is one of our teachers here in the church. He is a very good Bible student and a very good teacher. But he never talks much about his job resume. But I'm going to make him do it. He's got 2 jobs. So tell us about your jobs.
Well, I work at Toyota. We have a headquarter office here for North America. So I'm an executive there. And then I work at Georgia Tech, which is my alma mater, where I went to school. And I run an academic program there for project management and teach there.
Yeah. What's your official title in each of those places?
For Toyota, official title is Chief Engineer, GM. And then my official title at Georgia Tech is Academic Program Director.
Okay. Yeah. So this guy's a heavy hitter, but the best part is he's a disciple of Jesus, loves the Bible, as does Michelle, and they're great parents and just good friends to many, many people. I'm very proud to be a friend of theirs and very proud to have them on because we're talking about racial issues, and I think they'll shoot straight with us on some things that we'll end up asking. But I'll let you start off on the session about God's love of variety and how that applies to humans. What questions do you have?
Want me to go first? Okay. I'll go first, Gordon.
All right.
I like the part where you talked about just the diversity of creation. God's creation is very vast. What do you think about God creating many kinds of peoples? I often think of Genesis 10, Table of Nations.
Right.
After the flood, right? This is Noah's sons. And they go out and they basically establish different types of people. I've always thought about that scripture being really interesting to me, but what are your thoughts just on that period of time and how God was bringing about many kinds of people?
Well, God created everything he created, animals and humans alike, he created us, plants as well, to be able to adapt to an environment. And so the difference in us and how we look, the color of our skin, etc., all that is strictly environmentally produced in our ancestors. So when God said to populate the earth, that meant that he built within us the capability of adapting. And I think it's because he loved variety. He could have made it all one climate, maybe San Diego would be my choice, but because there's so many climates, we had to be able to adapt. And that's what we did. That's what the human race did. They adapted to the environment, and it made us different. And because we're separated from each other in a lot of different ways, we developed different customs and different food, because all of that was also environmental. What food do you have available? And what kind of music can you develop? And so God obviously loves variety because of all the variety you see in all of nature, including humanity. So that'd be my answer to that one.
I love it. Love it. Fantastic. Insightful.
I have a question. What should we make of God choosing the Israelites as his chosen people, his chosen race? And speaking of that throughout the Old Testament, now, how should we view that fact that's stated in the scriptures?
Well, there's sort of two parts of it. Why he chose Abraham, evidently Abraham was head and shoulders above anybody else around at the time. And God could foresee how that nation would develop. But he's the father of the faithful, so God chose him and chose to bring Christ through that nation. So all the reasons I have no way of knowing, actually, because there were a lot of characters within that whole lineage of Christ. I mean, a lot of different things. And some of that gives us hope, Several women in the lineage of Christ, they didn't have the resume that you do. You had a prostitute, you had different things in the lineage. But even that gives us hope. If he could use them and work through all the things that they did and still come out with Jesus to bless the world with, that's encouraging itself. So that's kind of the past part of it and the Old Testament part of it. Are you asking about any present thing or just?
Well, I think there's always the desire for certain groups of people to self-proclaim them to be God's chosen people.
Yeah.
So if that's our tendency, and that was actually said of a group, how should we view that?
Well, he chose them for a set purpose. And of course, that made them think that they were superior to everybody else. The Jewish race was superior because they had a very highlighted role in humanity. Then, when Jesus came and the gospel was for the whole world, then it was a level playing field, and the Jews had a very hard time with that. To think that a Gentile had the same access to God and was just as important to God as they were individually. And so, in a sense, a very good question. I never thought of it exactly this way and tying it in with race, but they thought they were the superior race.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of what Paul wrote was, no, you're not. You were used for a special purpose, but there were a bunch of things in your history that you're not too proud of. And we're all on equal ground, and no one's more important than the other. And so if you applied that some way today, you could say the white race, a lot of white people think they're the superior race. And that's what we're talking about in this lesson. And the next episode that we'll do is no, you're not God used you in some ways
Mm-hmm.
that were important and needful, but that didn't make you superior. How God chose to use you didn't make you superior. So white people are not superior, but like the Jews, some of them are very confused about that and very prideful and very wrong.
Mm.
And so all the racial tension and stuff between black and white is just not dissimilar, actually, to the Jew Gentile issue back then. But Paul was very, very clear. We are all the same in God's sight, and no one is worth any more than anybody else or superior in any way. So that's a deep question.
Well, I have another one for you too.
Okay. Go for it.
We were just talking about this.
All right.
You know, when we see, depictions of Jesus
Mm-hmm.
on the television screen, it's
Right.
usually a light-skinned Caucasian person.
Right.
And we know that he wasn't a Caucasian person.
Right.
That's not how God decided to come. But one question I posed was, do you think the gospel would really have spread as much as it did if God didn't use white people or colonization or even the depiction of Jesus as a white person? Would white people be Christians if Jesus that was depicted in media or preached was a person that was brown?
Well, we look at that through 21st century eyes. The truth is, if you go back in the history of America, white became a social and legal construct. It was made up. And so there were white-skinned people that weren't considered white in the early days of our country. And historically, then they began to be considered as white to make them do the same work as the black people, but they were made to feel superior. So they would still do this work because at least they're not black. So there's a lot of weird and bad history in our country. So I don't think color of skin mattered nearly as much in the early days. So it's a modern question you're asking. Would it have mattered in America? Probably, yeah.
Or worldwide?
Or worldwide, perhaps so. But like the early Christians had to deal with it, they had to get all that out of their system and recognize that we're all equal and extremely valuable before God, and that color or race, even though there is no such thing as race as we use it scientifically, we got to get that stuff out of our system. But those are really good questions there. Yeah, make me think. I'll have to think more on that, but it's a broader thing. And historically, would it have worked in America without being like it is? Maybe not. I'll trust God on that. So I'm not so worried about the white part. What bugs me is the black part and how black people got treated and how they even got to America by being stolen. And all of that. You know more about all that than I do. But anyway, whatever the case was, it needs to end. And we need to see all people, ethnicities, color, etc. We need to see all people as the same before God because we flat out are without question. And so we need to, enough of stupid. We've had enough of stupid in our history. So we'd like to get smart biblically and get stupid out. Because all black people are tired of stupid. And some white people like me are tired of stupid when it comes to all this racial stuff. I think politicians stir it up and use it. I think politicians have done more damage on this thing than anybody. Well, anyway, I'm not going to get into politics. I'm sort of like Barclay and what he said about the whole thing and Malcolm X. I mean, they said both sides, both parties are using black people for their own ends politically. That's what I believe. That's about as political as I'm going to get. I'm not very happy about any politics. So, you got another question there? Your wife's pushing me off into deep. She's pushed me off.
She got heavy hitters. She got the heavy questions.
So I'll probably get all these letters about Ferguson. You don't know what you're talking about here, and it'd be true. I mean, she's pushing me off into some territory that I did not cover in my presentation.
I just love the point that you made, though. I just want to say it again, that even though God chose you to do his work, that doesn't mean you're superior.
Exactly.
I love that because, like you said, God chose a group of people to bring about Jesus. They didn't know that that was actually going to happen when they were living in the moment.
Right.
And so, and then even with maybe even how the gospel was spread throughout the world, there were some questionable ways that it was done.
Right.
But still, it was done, and maybe God still worked through it somehow. But that doesn't mean that the people that God chose were superior.
Exactly.
And I love that point. And I think that's one point to really listen to.
Yeah. So God has this thing. I mean, even individually, Paul said, what do you have that God didn't give you? And so if he gave you a gift that is used for good, why should that make you prideful? Because it was a gift to start with. And you could have been born with no capability at all. And if God gave you some capabilities and some gifts, there's nothing to be proud of. It's something to be grateful for to God, because anything that happens good out of any of our lives is God. I'll take responsibility for all the bad. It's my fault. But all the good that's done is God in spite of us, using us for good. So whatever good I've done, that's the way I look at it. God used me in spite of me.
Yeah.
Not so much because of me, and whatever was because of me was because of his gifts that worked in me. So the inferiority, superior combination, I mean, he nailed that pretty good in 1 Corinthians 12. He talked about the people that viewed themselves negatively, and then the ones that thought they were superior because of their spiritual gifts. In that case, wasn't racial at all. Your spiritual gifts. And he basically says, what do you have that God didn't give you? So why do you boast? And I think that's a great point that everyone has to remember. And so whatever anybody did, regardless of their ethnicity, anything done that was good, God ultimately did it.
Yeah.
And if we could get pride out of it and get humility in it, then we could appreciate God's creation, all of it. And to me, if you can appreciate the fact that there are all those different species of birds and they all sound different and look different and all of that, why in the world can we not view people that way and take much joy out of the fact that God made us different and we all bring something different to the table? And I had a very limited diet growing up, as a kid. We didn't have a lot of money and we had a fairly limited diet. I didn't know anything about Chinese food. I didn't know anything about Japanese food. I didn't know anything about tons of different kinds of food or music or whatever. I'm grateful for all the variety, for what it, for the joy it brings to life.
Totally.
So variety is not something to create divisions in us. It ought to make us appreciative. As I say, not colorblind, except as far as value before God goes, but color aware and color appreciative. I love all the differences.
Wow, I like those terms are fantastic, Gordon. Color aware. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that just struck me. Color aware and color appreciative.
Yeah.
Could you expound on that? That thought, those terms?
Well, it's simple. I mean, I hear some people say colorblind just because they don't want to talk about race.
Right.
And to a black person, they think, so I'm told, I'm not black, 12%. But DNA test. But anyway, almost lost my point on my DNA test, but what was my point? Anyway, some people say colorblind is a way to dodge talking about it. But if I'm a person of color and you tell me you're colorblind, does that mean that my color doesn't count?
No.
I mean, that's the way a lot of my black friends have said it affects them. What do you mean colorblind? I'm black and happy that I'm black. So anyway, color aware means that I see color. I see a black guy that's probably got some other stuff mixed in, as most all of us do, including me. And I see you, and I know that you're half black and half Japanese, right?
Yeah.
And so I see all of that in you, and that makes it beautiful.
Yeah.
I love not only the different ethnicities, I love the mixes.
Yeah.
My son is Caucasian, his wife is Asian. My 3 grandsons look Asian. I love that.
Yeah. And they're beautiful boys.
They're beautiful boys.
They
you know?
are. Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I mean. Colorblind, no. Color aware, yes. I can see color, but I appreciate it.
That's
I
awesome.
love the differences in us, all of them.
It's huge. That's awesome. I wish more people, Gordon, viewed things like that. I talk to people all the time.
Yeah.
And even my teams and my jobs at work, and we have a really diverse team, my team at work. And we love that about ourselves. We look around the table. We just had a team dinner holiday party this week, and we were looking around the table and we were just reflecting on how diverse of a team we are. And everyone was just commenting on their appreciation for someone else and what they bring.
What they bring
to the table. And I just think that I have just not heard those two terms used together like that. And I really like that. It's just, that's a loving way to view people.
Well, it's God's way.
Yeah.
We're following God. We got to view people like God does.
Yeah.
He made us. As a little poor boy said one time, he said, God made me and God don't make no junk. I love that little cartoon thing, but that's totally true.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to cut off here, and we'll have another session, and we'll get a little more specific on some things, and I'll have some questions for you. But thanks for being with us. You guys are a blast. You are immensely talented, but you just got a way of loving people and making us feel loved. So thanks for putting up with an old dude like me.
Thank you.
Thanks for being. God bless.
Yeah.